The salt spray hit Margaret's face as she stood at the edge of the pier, clutching the worn leather journal she'd discovered in her late father-in-law Samuel's belongings just hours after his funeral. And as she opened it to the first page, tears streaming down her cheeks, she read words that would forever change everything she thought she knew about the man she'd misunderstood for 15 years. To my daughter-in-law Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I've passed on, but before I go, I need you to know the truth about why I kept my distance, and why I never told you, or my son David, about the inheritance that was meant to bring us together, not tear us apart. Margaret's hands trembled as she remembered all the family gatherings where she'd sat across from Samuel, interpreting his quiet nature as disapproval, his reserved demeanor as rejection of her presence in his son's life, never knowing that behind those gentle brown eyes was a man carrying a burden of love, so heavy it had shaped every interaction they'd ever had. And now, standing where Samuel used to come every Sunday to fish and think, she began reading the journal that revealed how Samuel, a successful marine biologist who'd built his fortune studying ocean conservation, had watched his own father lose everything to greed and family feuds over money, making him vow that his wealth would never corrupt the pure love he saw between David and Margaret when they first met at the aquarium where Samuel volunteered, teaching children about marine life with the patience of a saint and the enthusiasm of someone half his age. I watched you that first day, the journal continued, saw how you looked at my David with such genuine affection, how you laughed at his terrible jokes about seahorses, how you held his hand without caring who was watching, and I knew you loved him for him, not for what he might inherit someday, which is why I made the difficult decision to never speak of the trust fund I'd established, never mention the oceanfront research facility I'd built, never reveal that everything I'd worked for would one day be theirs, because I wanted to preserve that purity of love I'd witnessed, even if it meant you might think I was cold or unwelcoming. Margaret sank onto the wooden bench where Samuel used to sit, remembering their awkward conversations at Christmas dinners, the stilted small talk at birthday parties, the way he'd always seemed to leave the room when she entered, not knowing that he was protecting something precious, that his distance was actually his way of ensuring their love remained untainted by material considerations. And as she read on, she discovered that Samuel had spent years documenting their life together in secret, collecting photos from David's social media, newspaper clippings of Margaret's work as a teacher at the inner-city school, proud notes about every milestone they'd achieved together, from their modest wedding that Samuel had watched from the back row to avoid making Margaret nervous, to the day they'd adopted their daughter Emma from foster care, a decision that had moved Samuel to tears because it showed they valued love over bloodlines, just as he'd raised David after his wife passed away when David was only 3 years old. The journal revealed how Samuel had struggled with terminal illness for 2 years without telling anyone, not wanting to burden the young family with his medical troubles, instead spending his final months setting up a foundation in their names that would fund ocean education programs for underprivileged children, combining Margaret's passion for teaching with his love for marine conservation, creating something that would honor both their legacies while bringing them together in purpose. And Margaret sobbed as she read about the nights Samuel had spent alone in his beach cottage, writing letters to Emma that she would receive on each birthday until she turned 18, sharing wisdom about the ocean, about kindness, about how her grandfather had learned that the greatest treasures weren't found in bank accounts but in the moments when families chose love over pride, understanding over assumption, and forgiveness over resentment. I know you thought I didn't approve of you, Samuel had written in shaky handwriting near the end of the journal, but the truth is, I was in awe of you, Margaret, of your strength in standing by David through his struggles with anxiety, of your dedication to those children at your school, of the way you never asked for anything more than what you had earned with your own hands. And it reminded me so much of my late wife Clara that sometimes it hurt to look at you, to see that same fierce independence and compassion that had made me fall in love all those years ago. And I'm sorry if my grief made you feel unwelcome, when all I ever wanted was to preserve the beautiful family you and David were building, without the shadow of money hanging over it." Margaret stood up and walked to the end of the pier where Samuel had asked to have his ashes scattered, understanding now why he'd chosen this spot where the ocean met the sky, where boundaries dissolved and everything became one endless horizon of possibility. And she pulled out her phone to call David, who answered on the first ring, his voice thick with grief. And she told him to bring Emma and meet her at the pier immediately, because she had something important to share. And when they arrived 20 minutes later, David's eyes red from crying, and Emma clutching her favorite stuffed dolphin that Grandpa Samuel had given her last Christmas, Margaret handed them the journal and watched as understanding dawned on their faces. As David realized his father's seeming coldness had been the deepest form of protection, and as Emma, wise beyond her 7 years, said quietly, "Grandpa was like the ocean, wasn't he? Keeping his treasures hidden deep down, where only the brave ones who dive in can find them." They spent the rest of the afternoon on that pier, reading passages from the journal aloud, laughing through tears at Samuel's observations about their family life, his secret pride in David's career as a social worker, his joy at Emma's curiosity about sea creatures, and his carefully laid plans for the research facility that would bear all their names, not just his, because he believed that family was built on shared purpose, not shared blood. And as the sun began to set, painting the ocean in shades of gold and amber, Margaret pulled out the small urn containing Samuel's ashes and looked at her family, seeing in their faces the same realization she'd come to, that love sometimes disguises itself as distance to protect what matters most, and that understanding someone's heart requires looking beyond their actions to the fears and hopes that drive them. David took his wife's hand and his daughter's hand, forming a circle at the edge of the pier, and together they opened the urn, letting Samuel's ashes dance on the ocean breeze, returning him to the waters he'd studied and loved. While Emma sang the ocean song Samuel had taught her about how every drop of water eventually finds its way home, and Margaret whispered an apology to the wind for all the years she'd misunderstood his silence, promising to honor his memory by running the foundation with the same quiet dignity he'd shown, teaching children that the ocean's greatest lesson isn't about its vastness or power, but about how it accepts all rivers equally, no matter where they come from or what they carry, just as Samuel had accepted her into his family, protecting their love with his distance so it could grow strong in its own light. 6 months later, at the grand opening of the Samuel Thompson Ocean Education Center, Margaret stood before a crowd of children from her school, donors from the community, and families who'd known Samuel through his years of quiet philanthropy, and she told them the story of a man who loved so deeply he was willing to be misunderstood, who valued authentic relationships over comfortable ones, and who believed that true inheritance isn't what we leave behind in bank accounts, but what we plant in hearts. And as she cut the ribbon with David and Emma beside her, she saw in the crowd an elderly woman who introduced herself as Samuel's estranged sister Ruth, whom he'd been secretly supporting for years after she'd fallen on hard times, never telling anyone because he didn't want gratitude to complicate love. And Ruth embraced Margaret with tears in her eyes, saying, "He wrote to me about you, said you were the daughter he never had, but always hoped for. Someone who would understand that family isn't about what we're entitled to but what we choose to build together." And in that moment, Margaret finally understood that Samuel's greatest gift wasn't the money or the facility or even the journal, but the lesson that love doesn't always look like what we expect, that it sometimes wears the disguise of restraint, of careful boundaries, of trusting others to find their own strength, rather than making their path easier with revelations of wealth. And as she watched Emma lead a group of children to the touch tanks, explaining about starfish with the same patience Samuel had shown, Margaret knew that the inheritance that truly mattered was already being passed on. One gentle gesture at a time, one quiet act of faith at a time, one choice to see beyond the surface at a time, just as Samuel had done every day of his life, turning his loneliness into legacy, his silence into symphony, his distance into the deepest form of devotion, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't written in grand gestures, but in the spaces between words, in the things we don't say, to protect what matters most, in the inheritance of understanding that comes not from money, but from finally seeing someone's heart as it truly was, beautiful and broken and brave enough to love from afar, ensuring that when the time came for revelation, it would bring not greed but gratitude, not division but unity, not resentment, but the kind of reconciliation that can only come when we realize that we've been loved all along, just in ways we were too hurt, or proud, or afraid to recognize. And as the ocean sang its eternal song outside the center's windows, Margaret touched the compass Samuel had left for Emma with a note that said, "True north isn't a direction. It's the people who help you find your way home." And she knew that even in death, Samuel was still guiding them toward each other, toward forgiveness, toward the understanding that family is not about blood or money, or even proximity, but about choosing to see the love that was always there, waiting patiently beneath the surface like treasure in the deep, ready to transform everything the moment we're brave enough to dive in and discover it.